Chapter 9, Hard Times and World War II. My Uncle Jesse had a farm down in Alabama with horses, cows, and chickens. He raised cotton and peanuts and also had a little patch of fruit and vegetables. Uncle Jesse and his family had made a good life for themselves out there in the country. Most of his neighbors were white folks, but there were a few black farmers sprinkled about. He often had trouble with his white neighbors because they considered him competition. In the South, black folks had to be careful about doing well. If they raised a better crop than their white neighbors, their crops and mills could end up in flames. For a spell, there were quite a few planters in the South. But that changed when the boll weaves came back. Folks like Uncle Jesse had to switch crops or move away to start over. Southerners still depended on the cotton industry, so they had some real hard times when the planters left. Most Northerners worked in factories, earning much more than Southerners who still mostly lived in the countryside and worked on farms. Very soon, things got even harder. On Thursday, October 24th, 1929, the U.S. stock market crashed. Only one day before, business was great, and stocks were traded at higher prices than they had ever been. But that Thursday, Americans could only watch as the market fell and stockbrokers panicked, selling the same stocks for pennies on the dollar. Banks, mines, and other businesses went bankrupt. Soon, the country was plunged into a very bad economic time called the Great Depression. Millions of people lost every nickel they kept in the banks, and many more lost their jobs and then their homes. Black folks were hit especially hard. Many were thrown off the land they worked and were forced to live in poverty. Some Southerners were able to keep their jobs because the cost of labor was much less than up north. But their pay fell so low, it wasn't enough to live on. Millions of people were scared and hungry. Everywhere there were long food lines, and people in New York who lost their homes set up tents in city parks. To make things worse, there was a drought in the Midwest. Crops dried up, and farmers were forced to abandon their land. People looked for help from the government, but the folks on Capitol Hill couldn't do much. The hard times lasted for about 10 years. All the while, Adolf Hitler, the new leader of Germany, who had come to power in 1933, started making trouble in Europe. It was only the beginning of something bigger than anyone could ever imagine. In the late 30s, a young black boxer named Joe Louis fought a German fighter named Max Schindling. Hitler bragged that Schindling was going to show the world how Germans were a supreme race by winning the fight. Hitler didn't care much for black folks or anyone else who wasn't blonde and blue-eyed. Louis had lost to that young man 2 years before and hoped to fix things on this go-round. It grew into a really big thing, something closer to a huge political event rather than a boxing match. The eyes of the whole world were fixed on those two young men. When the bell rang, Louis jumped out of his corner and beat that poor fella into a pulp in a single round. So much for the Supreme, honey. We celebrated, but deep down, we all knew it was just a boxing match. The real fight was much worse. We followed what was happening in Europe, listening to the radio and reading the papers. It was such a frightening thing. The Nazis had it in their minds to take over the whole world. They had taken over Germany by assassinating political leaders and then began invading neighboring countries. By the middle of 1941, the Nazis had occupied much of Europe. And even worse, there were rumors that they were murdering the Jewish people by thousands, shooting, starving, gassing, and burning those poor people to death. America tried hard to stay out of it. But then on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, Japanese planes flew over to Hawaii and bombed our naval base in Pearl Harbor, killing thousands of our servicemen in a surprise attack. We couldn't stay out of it anymore, honey. It was time to saddle up and fight. The next day, President Franklin Roosevelt declared war on Japan, and every person in America was behind him. Young men and women from every state signed up to serve in the war, and many more were drafted. Lord knows I couldn't go, as I had to take care of my own children. But my two younger brothers went off to that war. Not that I wanted them to go, mind you, but it was the hardest thing in the world. But I understood why they wanted to go and what they were fighting for. So we gave them our blessings and prayed we'd live to see them home again. There were some white folks who thought this was a white man's war and turned black folks away when they went to sign up. But we had just as much to lose as they did, maybe even more, considering the Nazis' feelings about people. Some black folks thought that the worst place in the world for a young black man was in the United States Army. And they were right, to a point. Black soldiers were at the mercy of their white superiors, some of whom were Southerners who didn't like black folks. They were segregated from the white soldiers and sent to the front in battle or made to swab the decks, cook, clean, and unload weapons from the ships. That wasn't the service they signed up for. Some black soldiers didn't mind it. But a lot of those young men signed up to fight, not to serve or clean up after white folks. White officers believed that black men weren't smart or brave enough to fight with white soldiers, or fly planes, or drive tanks. But after we invaded Europe in the summer of 1944, the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, pushed President Roosevelt to put black soldiers in the fight. She had a good heart and was a great friend to black folks and everyone who was in need. The military gave in, calling it an experiment. The Tuskegee Airmen, the 332nd, and the 761st Tank Battalion were put into action. Now, I'm not bragging much, but our boys were some of the best combat soldiers and bomber escorts in the world. The 332nd pilots had the record for losing the fewest bomber planes in more than 200 missions and were so good at escorting and protecting them, they were specially requested for the job. When most tank battalions lasted only 17 days on the battlefield, The 761st, an all-black unit, fought for 183 days straight, longer than any other battalion in the whole war. They helped win the Battle of the Bulge. And I'm proud to say that both my brothers were right there with them, giving it to Germans. But would you believe that after all that fighting they did for the country, the black soldiers were mostly ignored? White units got their medals during the war and were commended by the president, while our soldiers were honored several decades later. It didn't make sense. We had gone to war for our country to stop racist people from taking over the world. And yet, at home, Jim Crow held us in his grip just as tightly as before. When the war was over, both my brothers returned and saw that nothing had changed. They had been to places like France and England where black folks were treated just the same as white folks, and came home only to have to sit in the back of the bus. We figured if our soldiers were able to fight and defeat racism overseas, we couldn't do it over here. The stories about equality in Europe let us know that this kind of thing was possible. It weighed heavy on our minds and pushed many of us to stand up again to fight for what we deserved. It was time to make things right. Jim Crow's days were numbered. Chapter 10, Black Innovation. You may have heard folks say that black people invented shoes. But child, that is not true. Everybody invented shoes. But it is true that in the 1800s, a black man named Ernest Mattlinger invented a machine that made the process of making shoes a lot cheaper and faster. Mattlinger is one of the many black folks whose ideas have made the lives of people in the world a lot better. Black people have been making inventions since slavery days. Plenty of very practical things that helped us do the work we were forced to do. Africans invented new ways of fishing, farming, basket weaving, and ironsmithing. Since then, we've invented ways of keeping food fresh, with curing it with salts and refrigeration, lubricating engines, safely linking train cars, controlling traffic flow, improving light fixtures, helping firefighters breathe in smoke-filled rooms, and making supercomputers faster, among many other things. Everybody knows that we have created brilliant types of music like spirituals, jazz, blues, gospel, rock and roll, and so on. And that we have done very well in athletics. Yes, honey, we all know that, even if we try to downplay it. But we've done much more. Have you ever used an ironing board? Sat in a folding chair? Used a dustpan? Ridden in a convertible or on a horse saddle? Read an almanac? Used a fountain pen that did not require dipping into an inkwell? Sat at a traffic light? Seen a gas mask? Used a golf tee? Turned on an electric light bulb? Eaten food delivered by a truck? Used an ice cream scooper? Gone to a blood bank? Used a batting helmet or shin guard? Or enjoyed potato chips? I bet you have. Most people don't know that all of these things were invented by or improved by black folks. One of our finest inventors was a fella named Elijah McCoy. Among many other useful things like the ironing board and lawn sprinkler, he invented a lubricating cup that oiled the gears of a train engine. Several people tried to copy his invention, but folks who knew quality only wanted the real McCoy. Another inventor, Lewis Latimer, improved on Edison's electric lamp by inventing a filament that could be produced much more cheaply. George Washington Carver was one of our most gifted inventors. He loved nature and going out of his genius of making plants grow. He invented hundreds of products from soybeans, sweet potatoes, and peanuts, from soap to ink to synthetic rubber. Frederick M. Jones invented a portable X-ray machine and a refrigeration unit for food delivery trucks, ships, and airplanes. Dr. Charles Drew figured out how to separate blood cells from plasma to preserve blood longer than the week or so it lasted when it was whole, which led to the creation of blood banks all over the world. Annie Malone and Madam C.J. Walker invented hair-growing lotions that were so popular they made millions of dollars. Walker used her wealth to help with the movement to get the vote for women. Jared Morgan invented the first automatic traffic signal. Granville Woods invented a train-to-train communication system. Otis Boykin invented a control device for guided missiles and computers, and the pacemaker. I could go on forever, honey, but I left out what is probably the most important idea ever introduced to America by an African American. It was brought to us by a young preacher from Georgia who used it to change the course of history. It was a tactic he learned from Mahatma Gandhi, who used it to free his people in India from British rule. The young preacher combined it with ideas from the Good Book and America's Declaration of Independence to create a new message that spoke to all people, a message that had more power than any fist, gun, or bomb. This young man was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and the idea was the peaceful protest. Chapter 11, Jim Crow's A-Dying. I heard a story once about a black boy in the South who used to ride the city bus home from school every day. As was the custom, he sat in the back of the bus, just behind the sign that split the bus into white and colored sections. One afternoon, a white kid got on the bus and sat right in front of the sign where the black boy was sitting. He stared at the young fella and then at the sign, back and forth for several stops, as if to taunt him. There was a door at the back of the bus, and when the bus pulled up to the next stop, the black boy grabbed the sign and stuck it in his satchel and took off running down the street. The white kid yelled to the driver, "That boy stole the sign." The driver jumped off the bus and yelled at him to come back, but the young fella hightailed it all the way home. He still has that sign too. Now, it was not right for him to break the law. But just like many people in the South who were tired of Jim Crow laws, He felt that if the law says that you are less than equal to whites, then it is a bad law, and some laws need to be broken. After World War II, a young soldier named Jackie Robinson joined the Negro League baseball team in Kansas. He played well enough to catch the eye of Branch Rickey, a part owner of the Major League Brooklyn Dodgers. Rickey was so impressed with Robinson, he hired him to play for his team despite the ban on black players. Jackie became the first black ball player to play in the major leagues since the 1880s. White folks in the ballpark harassed that man for 2 years straight. White players pushed and spiked him, while white fans yelled and threatened him. But in spite of it all, Jackie played very well. He went on to be one of the best players in baseball and showed people that black folks were more than equals on and off the field. It was the beginning of a new day for baseball and for the country. Now, I told you that our country grew big and strong from slave labor, but it came of age by way of the Second World War. America came out of World War II, the strongest nation in the world. But in the South, Jim Crow was still the law of the land. Laws were supposed to make black and white folks separate but equal. But black folks were only separate. While white folks generally had the best schools and supplies, black schools were shabby at best. They had only few buses that worked. Black children were crowded into one-room schools. Supplies were always short. Books were outdated. Leftovers from white schools. And in some high schools, there weren't even enough to even offer to black children because the local government felt they didn't need it. Nothing about the school system was equal. We knew that the key to giving our children a chance in life was a good education. And the only way to get it was if we fought for it. So began the struggle for truly equal education. Several Southern black parents began trying to put their children in white public schools and were, of course, turned away. Reverend Brown from Kansas tried to send his little girl to a white school near their house in Topeka and was met with the same result. So he sued the school board. A lawyer with the NAACP, Thurgood Marshall, took up the case and argued it before the Supreme Court. He won, too, and black children gained the right to attend white public schools. It was hard for the children, though. They just wanted to go to good schools like everybody else. But the people down there were so mean about the whole thing. Integrating schools was very dangerous business, you know. But the children were brave. Every morning, all year long, the children had to face angry crowds of shouting and spitting parents and were harassed by their classmates and teachers. In Little Rock, Arkansas, 9 black students were blocked from entering their new high school. President Eisenhower had to send armed troops to escort the children into the building. In Birmingham, Alabama, a preacher tried to enroll his children in a white school, and he and his wife were beaten up very badly. A few years later, The governor in Alabama himself stood in front of the door to a university to block black students from entering. What kind of grown man would do such a thing? It took a very long time to get the schools to abide by the court's decision. Having the right to do something and being allowed to do it are two different things. One by one, segregated schools had to be sued to allow black children to enroll. And still, to this day, schools still aren't all the way integrated because of clever neighborhood zoning or lack of busing. Busing was a problem in Alabama, too. In 1955, in Montgomery, a seamstress left work and headed home on a segregated bus late one afternoon. She took a seat at the front of the bus, of the colored section. Now, if you believe this, when a white fella got on the bus, the driver told her to get up and give her seat to him. "Excuse me?" Mrs. Parks said. The driver came back raising a fuss, talking about how she had better get up or he was going to call the police and come and arrest her. Like every other black person in America, Mrs. Parks was tired of being treated like a second-class citizen. She was sick and tired of giving her seat up to white folks on buses. Sick and tired of being refused service in restaurants, hospitals, department stores, and hotels, and of having to buy second-rate food from the back doors of cafes and entering movie theaters from the rear to sit in hot balconies to see a show. Sick and tired of being forced to drink from segregated water fountains when she shouldn't have to. Indeed, Mrs. Parks and millions more of us were sick and tired of being sick and tired. Mrs. Parks did not move for that white man on the bus and was arrested and sent to jail. Now, it could have ended there. When Mrs. Parks got out of jail, she could have just gone back to work. You see, she was not the first black person in Montgomery to be arrested for refusing to give up a seat on a bus to a white person. But she was very well known and respected in her community. She was a perfect example of the unfair treatment that black people were made to suffer in Montgomery, and the rest of the South for that matter. The community rallied around Mrs. Parks, and black leaders decided to organize a boycott of the buses in Montgomery. They chose a young preacher from Atlanta named Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to lead the boycott. It was agreed that no black person in Montgomery would ride a bus on the following Monday. And come Monday, every bus in Montgomery was just about as empty as a poor man's pocket, honey. Black folks boycotted the buses the next day, the next week, the next month. Mostly black maids and washwomen rode the buses in Montgomery. And for months, they walked to work or found rides with carpools, rain or shine. Without their business, the bus companies almost went bankrupt. The boycott continued through the winter and into the next year. Of course, the businesses and government in Montgomery fought the boycott tooth and nail, even bombed Dr. King's house. But in the end, they had to surrender. Dr. King knew that if black folks held to the boycott and did not fight back with violence, but with peaceful protests, they would be victorious. And on December 20th, 1956, 381 days after the boycott began, Dr. King called for the end of the boycott, and the Supreme Court ruled that black folks all over America had the right to sit anywhere they wanted on buses without any shouting, shooting, fighting, or fussing. Black folks won a major battle for equality through nonviolent demonstrations. Glory, hallelujah. Oh, how we celebrated all over the country. It was the sweet and wonderful victory. There would be setbacks and victories to come in the very near future, but we savored this one for quite some time, honey. Chapter 12, Revolution. Something good had started in Montgomery, and it spilled all across the country. Young people grabbed hold of the movement the grown folks started and took it over. To show how different they were from their parents' generation, they started wearing their hair long, and their clothes became louder and more colorful. The music, honey, the music was louder and more soulful. The sounds of angry electric guitars and powerful drums echoed through our neighborhoods as we sang along with songs from James Brown, Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud, and Sam Cooke, A Change Is Gonna Come. College kids started to challenge the segregation laws, starting with the Woolworth's Cafe in Greensboro, North Carolina. 4 black students just went in there and sat down at the white folks' lunch counter. They were later put in jail, but people heard about it and started doing all over the South, going to white-only movie theaters, pools, churches, libraries, and such, trying to break Jim Crow. Dr. King joined them too, and there were even a number of us older folks who felt brave enough to get on board. We called ourselves Freedom Riders, and we filled cars and buses with white and black folks and rode all over the South, breaking segregation laws. This was a very, very dangerous thing, mind you. Those of us who were lucky were merely arrested and put in jail for a few days, but many of us were beaten very badly by policemen and mobs of white folks, and their buses and cars were burned. 3 years later, Ku Klux Klan members killed not only black folks, but some of the white folks who were helping to organize movements and get black folks registered to vote. And believe me when I tell you, it made everybody feel a little scared. But we kept moving forward. Like Dr. King told us, we've come too far to turn back now. There were other leaders in the movement, like A. Philip Randolph, Malcolm X, Adam Powell, Fannie Lou Hamer, and Medgar Evers. But it was Dr. King who spoke loudest of all. His message was clear. We cannot win this battle with violence. We cannot win it with hate. We can only win it with persistence, love, and nonviolence. And by reminding the nation and the people on Capitol Hill that our forefathers made a promise of freedom and justice for all when they signed that paper, we would become a nation's moral conscience and fight the battle for justice and equality. Dr. King marched us all over the South, trying to get the attention of the whole country. We just loved him and would have followed him anywhere. When he spoke, his powerful voice gave us all chills. It shook your spirit and got you excited and calmed you when you were scared. He was patient and took time to listen to everybody, even the children. And he was handsome too, honey, which didn't hurt one bit. In May of 1963, Dr. King and his team went down to Birmingham, Alabama, the most dangerous place in the South for black folks. They went to work marching people all over the city and got somebody's attention when they marched 600 children through Kelly Ingram Park. Most were teenagers, but some were as young as 6 years old. They skipped school to march on downtown Birmingham, holding hands and singing. Policemen ordered them to stop and then sicked their dogs on them and sprayed them with fire hoses. The water was strong enough to knock the bark off of a tree, and they turned it on the children. It knocked them down and ripped their shirts off, even pinned them against buildings and trees. It was downright shameful. Pictures of the march were shown on television screens and in newspapers all over the world. President John F. Kennedy had no choice but to settle things in Birmingham. Later that summer, Dr. King, Dr. Philip Randolph, and several leaders in the movement invited people from all over the country to join them in Washington, D.C. for a peaceful demonstration on the Mall to try to pass a civil rights bill to promote civil rights and economic equality for black people. Just about everybody I knew made the trip. We rode on a bus for hundreds of miles all the way to Washington. It was such a glorious day. We filed off the bus and joined a parade of people who were marching and singing, headed for the Lincoln Memorial, where great crowds of people were crammed together on the Mall. Black, white, brown, red, yellow folks were everywhere. It seemed like the whole world had come. It was almost like a dream. Seeing so many people there made us realize we were not alone in this struggle for equality. There were several speakers throughout the afternoon, but what I remember most was when Dr. King spoke. His powerful voice rose and fell and echoed over a sea of people as he spoke about his dream for America. He shouted, "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And if America is to be a great nation, this must become true. Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last." Dr. King roared. By the time he finished, people on the Mall were hugging and shouting and swaying and crying. It was a magnificent speech. It felt like we all got a little church that Wednesday afternoon. It wasn't long before President Kennedy promised to send a civil rights bill to Congress to guarantee equal rights for all American citizens, no matter what their color. He never got a chance to see it through. Just a few months later, he was shot and killed on a visit to Texas. President Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act into law in 1964 and the Voting Rights Act the following year. The government had finally said to the world that Jim Crow was dead. The time had come at last when the words written by our forefathers that all men are created equal, were honored by our government. It had taken hundreds of years, millions of lives, marches, rallies, protests, martyrs, wars, and much more for America to come closer than ever before to becoming what it was meant to be. Lord knows there were plenty more battles to fight, many more struggles and troubles to overcome. But at last, the idea that everybody counts was within reach. It was a glorious victory for all Americans and the beginning of a new struggle for every American to ensure that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. Come years later, we saw more trouble, wars. We saw leaders like Dr. King, Malcolm Shabazz, and Bobby Kennedy shot and killed by people who, as Dr. King put it, cannot disagree without becoming disagreeable. We watched cities burn, a man walk on the moon, presidents impeached, the Berlin Wall come down, millions more Americans march on Washington. We follow controversial elections and watch broken levees drown most of a city. There'd be plenty of trouble in the world, but a lot of joy too. Black folks began to do things that only decades before we hadn't dreamed of. African American generals commanded great armies for the first time. Black mayors and governors were elected in large cities. There were black principals in integrated schools, managers and owners of major professional sports teams. African American writers, actors, and directors won Nobel Peace Prizes and Academy Awards. And we saw the first black Supreme Court justices and astronauts. There were plenty of firsts, honey, but the best was saved for last. 45 years after Dr. King spoke on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, I marched my old legs to the polls along with millions of other Americans to vote in a historical election. It was the first time that an African American, Barack Obama, had won the Democratic nomination and appeared on the national ballot for President of the United States. As I cast my vote, I thought about my grandfather, Pat, who didn't live to see this moment, and my 3 children and 2 brothers who did. I thought about my mother and father and my aunts and uncles. I thought about Abe Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, and Harriet Tubman. I thought about President Kennedy and Johnson and Dr. King, Thurgood Marshall, the Freedom Riders, the marchers, and all the people who lived and died so that I might walk into this booth and cast my vote. I thought about them all and smiled. And as I walked away, I closed my eyes and said, "Thank you." Our centuries-long struggle for freedom and equality, equal rights, had helped to make America's promise of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness a reality for all Americans. We have come a mighty long way, honey, and we still have a good ways to go. But that promise and the right to fight for it is worth every ounce of its weight in gold. It is our nation's heart and soul.